Going live.
Good morning. Hello, thank you very much for joining us on this webinar about the Cyber Essentials changes that have just come into place. So I'm Emma Philpott. I'm the CEO of IASME. So just a little bit of background about who on earth we are. So IASME was a very, very small company back in 2014. We worked with the government to develop Cyber Essentials. So we represented usually the smaller organisations. That then became a certification scheme, and we were one of 2 pilot accreditation bodies. That grew to having 5 accreditation bodies delivering Cyber Essentials. But then the government decided that they would like just 1 organisation to deliver it so that they could work in partnership. So they put out a tender, which we luckily won. And so since April 2020, we've been the sole delivery partner for Cyber Essentials, working very closely with NCSC, which is the UK government. So we also have our own schemes that we run, which are not associated with the government. We have Cyber Assurance, an IoT security certification scheme, one for maritime, and we also deliver the Civil Aviation Authority's Assure scheme. Back to Cyber Essentials, as I said before, we work really closely with NCSC, and our technical team work to continually review the technical controls in Cyber Essentials to make sure that they stay relevant. There was a pretty big change to the technical controls last year, and then the change earlier this week it's not as significant as the last change, but it still is a significant change. So this webinar is to update you on that change, and I'm going to pass over now to Neil Firminger, who's our Cyber Essentials manager. He will go through an explanation of all the changes. Please use the question and answers on the side to ask any questions, and our technical team and myself will be answering the questions as we go along. Then when Neil has finished talking, we will read out some of the other questions and get an answer from Neil and the technical team. So I hope this is useful. We need your feedback. We welcome feedback from you because that's how we make the scheme better and make it more accessible. So without any more chat, I'm going to pass you over to Neil Firminger. Thank you very much, Neil.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. So I am the Cyber Essentials manager at IASME, and I've been involved with Cyber Essentials for 7 years. So I've held the position of an assessor, and I've worked at one of the certifying bodies, and I've been working with IASME now for the last 5 years, and I sit on the technical working group and help with the changes. I've also got one of my colleagues answering the questions. Andy today is also part of that technical working group. So we have been working on these changes over the last year, building on the ones that were released in January 2022. And this presentation is to talk you through those changes. And as Emma said, please post your questions in the Q&A as we go along. And when the presentation's finished, we will answer the ones that haven't been able to be answered via the chat at the time. So Cyber Essentials is a National Cybersecurity Centre accreditation. They are the owners of the scheme, and IASME, we are the delivery partner for them, and we've been doing that since April 2020, so for the last 3 years. Excuse me, I have to just change the presentation. There is a slight hiccup here. Just bear with me.
So while Neil's doing that, I can just confirm that the recording of this webinar will be made available. It'll be uploaded to IASME's YouTube channel. We usually like to share all the questions and answers as well. We will try and work out how to do that and try and make that information available later. But yes, certainly this recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. If you've still got questions after this event, you can email our customer services team on info@iasme.co.uk. And if you look at our website, there's also a phone number that you can ring and you'll get through to our customer services team. So yes, are you ready to go again, Neil?
Yeah, I'm back now. Apologies for that.
Great.
I do so many presentations and I've got so many on this subject, but I want to give you the exact one here for the changes rather than go into a dive over Cyber Essentials in the first place. Apologies for that. Okay, so this is kind of a workshop for you to understand the changes and clarifications, etc., that have come about since the changes in 2022. So I want to just give you an overview of something about device detail, which is important and helps you with your application. Then we'll discuss the April 2023 session, 2023 changes, and then it's up to you to pose your questions afterwards and we can discuss different aspects of the scheme. But the common areas are around scope, unsupported operating systems, unsupported software, BYOD, cloud services, and MFA. So the changes that have been proposed or have gone live actually this week and were published back in January is there's a clarification and a level of device detail. There's something about the grace periods which were extended to April 2023 and actually now on what is now known as the Montpellier question set no longer exist. So there are no grace periods on Montpellier. Clarification around supporting of firmware. Clarification on third-party devices in scope, which will help with your application process. Updates to device unlocking. Updates to malware protection. And guidance on zero trust and asset management. One of the areas we've had a lot of feedback about over the last year or so is about the level of detail required for the user devices within the assessment. We have had many discussions with outside or third parties involved with Cyber Essentials and stakeholders and feedback from applicants and many people trying to get CE about the level of detail required. So we made a change earlier in the year and it runs throughout the Montpellier question set, is that when we're talking about laptops, desktop servers, computers, tablets and mobile phones, we're only asking you for the details of make and operating system on those devices. However, when it comes to firewalls and routers, which are your devices that connect and protect you from the internet, we're asking for make and model, but not the specific version of firmware on those devices. By asking for make and model on these devices, the assessor is able to determine if those devices are still receiving security updates to the firmware, so they understand. They will understand then that when they're in support, and then they can assess for compliance against that requirement of the devices having a supported operating system. So in the firewall and router world, the firmware is the operating system of those devices. This change took immediate effect when it was announced at the beginning of February, and there have been a number of blogs and the question set has been updated to include the statement above to describe this measure. The grace periods were extended until April 2023, so that was until the last time you could, or until you could use on the Everdine question set. These now have no longer apply, so you now need to list your thin clients if they're in use in your organization, and they will be assessed for compliance of being supported and running a supported operating system. All cloud services must have MFA on the standard user accounts from now on. And unsupported software such as applications and devices running operating systems which are no longer supported by the vendor will now need to be in a network segment that is out of scope or has taken removed from the scope of assessment. But I will explain that a little bit further where I explain the rules around that shortly. So firmware, and I've touched on this with routers and firewalls, was previously a requirement to keep that updated and make sure the devices were running with supported firmware on the devices. Much discussion was had about this and the complexity in applying firmware updates and keeping devices up to date. So the definition has been changed to the firewalls and routers to firmware, etc., within the software definition. So you used to say firmware, so all firmware had to be supported, but we're now saying firewall and router firmware. Okay, again, that's why it's important to understand that firewall and router firmware is the operating system of the device, and that information, by providing the make and model of those firewalls and routers, there's enough information there for the assessor to judge compliancy for Cyber Essentials. The reason for the change was discussed with the NCSC, and threats to operating systems are more prevalent than threats towards direct firmware of devices. So that was the reason for the change, and that's the reason for the change in definition, and is in the requirements document available from the NCSC Cyber Essentials website. But as I say again, we're looking for make and model of the firewalls and routers only, so you don't provide model details for laptops, desktops, servers, or mobile phones anymore. We are just assessing the operating system compliancy there. Cyber Essentials, third-party devices. This is something that we have a lot of discussions about when contractors' devices may come into scope, when student devices may come into scope. We have given out general advice on this in the past, but it's been on a support call basis rather than something within the requirements document or something that is more public for you as the applicants to understand when ownership of certain devices applies and when they should be in your covered in your Cyber Essentials certificate. So we've created a table to help applicants clarify when a device is in scope, and this has also been included in the requirements document. And here is that table. This table it's taken a while for us to create, and we worked on it over the last year, but I would like to point out how this works. So you see across the top we have applicants, which is yourselves. If you own a device and it is issued to any of the people, types of people listed on the left-hand side of the table, those devices are in scope. Now, if the third party, so if your IT support company owns those devices, they are not in scope. And if it's BYOD, this is slightly different because you have some kind of approval process to allow the use of BYOD. There are times when those BYOD devices are in scope. So that's why they have the green tick. Now, the one we always have a lot of questions about here is student devices. So if the education establishment owns the device that a student is using, that is in scope. If it is not and is owned by the student, it is out of scope. But that student device should be connecting to a guest or student dedicated network in order to carry out their learning, etc., and accessing the systems they need at the time. So student devices in the main by default when on a guest network and or a dedicated student network are not in scope for Cyber Essentials. Hopefully this will make things clearer for you, but when you do come to the application process and you're trying to understand this table and see how it works and trying to see how your devices fit in, okay, please contact IASME at info@iasme.co.uk and we'll provide support, or talk to your certifying body or Cyber Essentials advisor for further advice on this. Just to be clear, this table is about the devices. When it comes to cloud services, which was introduced in January 2022, the cloud services used by a student will have to be configured to use MFA when that service has MFA available or an option to use MFA. So this table is only to be applied to devices, not cloud services. There has been an update to device unlocking. There is a brute force requirement within the or a failed login attempt requirement on your mobile devices, and it's come to light that one manufacturer in particular has a default setting here which cannot be configured by anybody else. It is only the vendor, and in this case we understand it's Samsung, and they have a requirement to lock a device after 15 failed login attempts. Currently, the requirements in the Cyber Essentials requirements document state it must be 10 failed login attempts. On this occasion with the Samsung devices, this cannot be changed, so it is deemed acceptable that 15 is allowable on Samsung devices because nobody can change it. Where it can be configured and changed by yourselves, or your IT support company can configure it for you, or however you manage your smartphones and mobile devices, you need to configure it to 10 failed login attempts. I say with Samsung's, we know it's 15. Again, if you're having trouble with this and understanding this requirement, again, talk to IASME, talk to your certifying body or your Cyber Essentials advisor. Now, one of the big changes this year is around malware protection and the software solutions available. There are a number of software solutions on the market and some very big players in this area that use a new form of preventing malware running on your devices. This is called behavioral scanning, or using artificial intelligence or AI scanning on your device, and it uses only this and not several measures like a lot of solutions do, using what was the old-fashioned method, or still used commonly, signature based software. So it downloads daily updates and assesses against the threats against those. So we've had to make a change in this area to allow what is now called next generation or next gen solutions that use this behavioral scanning artificial intelligence method of scanning for malware threats. So all we're asking now, rather than looking for daily updates and configuring it to update at least once a day, if you're using a signature-based software, that is still the best practice, and we would still expect that to see that happen. But because of these different next-gen solutions, we are looking for you to configure those solutions to the vendor's best practices. Now, they often have these available, and this will often mean making sure they have auto updates set and are updating as regularly as they do. They're often on the next gen solutions because they're using a complete different way of assessing the malware protection and how it provides that protection. They are often updating on a completely different time scale because they're looking for behavior, and that could be once a week, it could be once a month, it could be longer than that, but it needs to be configured to the published best practices of that vendor of the solution. Another option that was offered previously was sandboxing under malware protection. Sandboxing, we have had lots of discussions about this with the NCSC, and it has now been removed as an option as for protecting against malware, viruses, etc. This is seen as a solution that is difficult to understand and assess within Cyber Essentials, and is often been misused within the scheme to allow software, etc., that is no longer supported. So the removal of sandboxing actually comes down to understanding how strong a solution is, whether it is actually a malware protection solution, and talking to the subject matter experts at the NCSC, it is judged that it isn't actually a malware protection, but it's more of a data protection solution, etc. But it's hard to assess the effectiveness of sandboxing in this field, under this control, so it has been removed. So this has led, if you're doing the CE Plus or the audited version of Cyber Essentials, to some changes around how the tests are carried out. So because with the next generation solutions, there is no independent test files, manual checks of how the solution is configured will now need to be carried out by the assessors when they do a CE Plus audit or a Cyber Essentials Plus audit. We did a request for feedback on this change with all the CE Plus assessors, and we received positive feedback on this change, and they are now been instructed on how this can be done, and they will now carry out manual checks where possible. If a solution allows the checks that were previously carried out, which means using independent test files, they will use them in addition. So there is a slight change for CE Plus, but that's more for the way the assessors carry out the tests. We now move on to two new areas of guidance. Often we have zero trust mentioned to us, and often we say we get the comment, we do zero trust, and Cyber Essentials, for Cyber Essentials, that means we don't need to put any of the controls in place. That means here we've had to carry out an exercise to carry out if that was true or not. What we did, we used the NCSE's own zero trust model and carried out an assessment or a mapping exercise against their zero trust model to the Cyber Essentials requirements, and it was the conclusion was there is a direct correlation between Cyber Essentials controls and zero trust. So in the zero trust model, there are 6 areas of control that need to be considered, and this is on the NCSE model, and there's only one of those areas that is not part of Cyber Essentials, and that is monitoring and logging. So all the controls that are required for firewalls, your secure configuration, the use of MFA, the patching requirement to update within the 14 days, they all correlate and map across to the NCSE's zero trust model. This has also been agreed with the subject matter experts at the NCSE. So if somebody does come to us and say we're using zero trust, we would expect to see them to be able to comply with the zero trust or the Cyber Essentials controls, because they directly map across to that zero trust model. Asset management guidance is something also that is new here. So we are talking about asset management for the first time, and this is absolutely critical to understanding where you apply the controls that are outlined in Cyber Essentials. So you do need to understand which devices you have to apply them here. It isn't actually a specific control, but it is actually the details we require within the scoping section of the question set. So there is now guidance on this within the requirements and links across the NCSC's own asset management guidance. And this is because there is a trend being observed by the NCSC and IASME when engaging with organisations. They are not carrying out effective asset management. So asset management is not only understanding the devices you have within an organisation, it is also the software and the cloud services you are using. All the controls that are outlined in Cyber Essentials need to be applied to those devices and the software and the cloud services where they are outlined within the requirements document. This guidance is not a specific control, but is the foundations of Cyber Essentials to understand the devices you apply the controls on. And this guidance has been added based on evidence that has been presented to us by the subject matter experts, the NCSC, but also incident management and incidents that are observed by the NCSC where organisations have been attacked, where they have maybe an old server tucked away or old devices they forgot are connected to the internet, probably doing a job of running CCTV or something, but are connected to the same network. Those devices have been forgotten about and maybe running an unsupported operating system, and they have been the point of entry for a cyber attack. So this is why we've added the guidance, because we want to help and improve the cybersecurity position of companies, but to also help you, give you some awareness of identifying those devices, all the devices in your organization that should apply the controls. There are a number of question set changes, which is important when you apply. So if you apply for Cyber Essentials now, you'll be working on their version 3.1 Cyber Essentials requirements. And the question set to match that is now called Montpellier. That was released on Monday this week. There is a change of question set language. Usage has been changed to a more of a plain English style. This also matches a change of style within the requirements document as well. This is based on feedback that has been received. We've also added within the question set, so when you go through the assessment platform, you should be able to click on some links for additional guidance about the controls and the scoping. This guidance is something new. It's newly written guidance. It does link across if you use the readiness tool to prepare for Cyber Essentials. And also it is just the beginning of a whole set of work we're going to be doing about more guidance to help you apply for Cyber Essentials. And there'll be more linked articles from within those new articles that are published via the question set and the application portal, or the application portal. And one thing we noticed, there was a mismatch between the order of the controls in the question set and the requirements document. So we've changed the order of the controls in the requirements document to match the question set. So when you're working with both the question set and the requirements and side by side, they will follow the set order now. That should help just give some consistency to your process. So just to give you some timelines, the go live of the Montpellier question set was Monday of this week. Okay, that's the reason for this webinar. The Montpellier question set is planned to be in place for the next 2 years. Okay. We want to give you as applicants a period of stability. We understand that the changes over the last 2 to 3 years have presented challenges, but also we want to give you the option to get used to the changes and also apply the MFA requirements, etc., as you go along. But the next point, there's an asterisk against it. If technical changes are deemed necessary by the NCSC, we may have to make changes in that period of time, and that'll be based on trends in cyber incidents that is presented to us by the NCSE and their various teams. Any announcements will be made on the NCSE and IASME social media channels, and there will be links to that on a slide in a minute to show you our IASME social media channels, but I do encourage you to follow those as they are the best places to keep up to date with changes to the schemes. So there has been a change to the version 3.1 document language. This is more plain English and hopefully will be more understandable to applicants, but the technical controls still remain exactly the same. And as I say, the question set has also been changed to reflect this style. Okay, so there's some NCSE blogs that have been published to help over the last 12 months to explain some issues. So there's a debunking some myths. This talks about myths that surround the scheme. These have been in place. Well, this blog has been placed in since October, but many of the myths are actually about controls that have been placed from the start of the scheme since June 2014. So there is a blog there to explain that and why they are in place. We had a blog to talk about the grace period extension and when that would come to an end. But there was 2 update blogs on the 23rd of January explaining some of these changes in a little bit more depth, but giving you across the links to the question set and also the new requirements document. So, okay, that's actually the end of the presentation here, and thank you for your time, and apologies for the stuttered start there, but we're now willing to take questions via the Q&A channel, and I'm sure some of them have been answered already by my colleagues, but if you'd like to post any questions, please do. But please see links to our social media channels and see the email address. If you want to contact IASME about Cyber Essentials, it's either to ask questions about the scheme, how to apply, anything about the changes, or you have any support issues when you're doing the application, please contact us at info@iasme.co.uk.
Thank you very much, Neil. So now we're going to go through some of the questions that we haven't had a chance to answer yet. I'll ask Neil to help to start with. So the first one, with cloud services multi-factor authentication requirement, what happens if the service does not support MFA or SSO, either have any support whatsoever or have any support whatsoever? If the MFA SSO support is only offered on enterprise tiers, which are generally ridiculously priced, we've seen a 500% increase just to get MFA. Can a business accept the risk with a business case or risk assessment?
Okay, so we've adjusted the questions slightly for MFA this year. There are 4 questions regarding this, and the first 2 are information only questions. So if your service does not provide any form of MFA or single sign-on, or asks you to pay for MFA. Now this is a bit of an issue, the paying for MFA, because it's ethically it doesn't feel right, but unfortunately it follows much NCSE guidance that you should be applying MFA where it's available. So the rules are, if you've got SSO, yes, you must apply it and then make sure that MFA is on that. If they're asking you to buy or pay an additional just to have MFA, you'll need to do that. Now we've seen that with some procurement systems in the public sector, and it may not ethically be right, but it does mean you are better protected when you have MFA on those services. Where a service has no MFA at all, we ask you to list that. We will be collating that data, and the NCSE and IASME will be using that data to try and put pressure on those cloud services where it's not available. MFA is throughout NCSE guidance, and we have to remember it is their guidance that forms the controls in Cyber Essentials, and MFA is a crucial part of providing protection to your cloud services. So we will be looking at that. We will continue to monitor this, but there is no intention about risk appetite or letting a risk judgment be placed on that on the applicant. Those risk judgments are already been mitigated for by the controls in Cyber Essentials, because Cyber Essentials is based on a risk assessment which is looking at the cyber security for the UK by the NCSC. So they carry out the risk assessment. These are mitigations, but we do recognise there are issues around MFA where a lot of cloud services actually don't have MFA available. So you may be marked down for not having it available, but it will not cause an automatic failure of Cyber Essentials.
Thank you very much. Next question. All of our BYOD devices use network guest access when in our offices, which keeps them away from our servers. Does that mean they are not now within? No, that they are now within the scope?
If BYOD devices are connecting on a guest network, so that separates those devices away from the business networks of the organisation, those guest networks are not in scope for Cyber Essentials.
Great, thank you. We've had quite a few questions about charities. So this one says, many charity-based organisations rely heavily on volunteers who use their own personal devices to access services like email. Management of the volunteer's device is quite expensive to license and is financially quite impactful to the charity. Is there any guidance on how best to deal with volunteers to bring them in line with the Cyber Essentials requirements without having significant financial implications to the charity?
Okay, so we get lots of questions about this, and we know that BYOD for volunteers is a difficult issue to deal with, but they do present, those devices can still present a threat to the organisation, because often we know in many charities, etc., they have access to email systems, often data. We have seen volunteers through their BYOD devices having access to personal information via case management systems, etc. But there is a way to look at this. If they're connecting to a cloud service, etc., you need to look at what's called a conditional access policy. See if those devices, and look at your cloud services where this can be applied, at the level or whether the operating system of the device is supported or not. There is then the option to apply and inform your users with written documentations about the other controls that need to be applied. But if you've got some technical control, we can't allow just documented policy to be the only solution in this scenario. There needs to be some element of technical control. So monitoring whether the operating system is supported and up to date is the way to do that. We have spoken to charities over this and had positive feedback. And actually, what it's worth doing is investigating your cloud services, because many cloud services allow this. So Office 365 or MS365, Google Workspace offer this. We've seen this with some Citrix products, etc., that are often used in these organisations. That is one area. We will be writing further guidance on this because we recognise this is an issue, but we cannot, unfortunately, just exclude volunteers' devices. They can still present a threat to any organisation, like any other organisation using BYOD.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give Neil a bit of a rest now and ask Andy the next question. Will our SaaS application that is used by external users, i.e. not employees, need to enforce multi-factor authentication for those users?
Okay, so if it's not, hi everyone, so if it's not the users of the organisation that's certifying and they're not accessing that organisation's organisational data, it's not that organizational service, they're not included within the scope of their assessment. However, if they're using that SaaS application and they're subscribing to that SaaS application, should they then need to carry out their own Cyber Essentials assessment, then it would be included within their scope, so they would need to have MFA applied with them. So this means that if you are a cloud service provider providing a SaaS application, you may get some throughout this year now. A lot of your customers coming to you requesting that MFA is added to that service.
Thank you very much. Another one for Neil, I think this is one of your favourites, Neil. Zero trust. So this question says, it's a marketing phrase. What definition are you using?
We do see it used as a marketing phrase, and there's many people jumping on the bandwagon. But when we talk about zero trust, we are basing it on the NCSE's published zero trust model, which they published in, I believe, July 2021. That is what we call zero trust, and that's a good starting point to understand it. There is a good overview of zero trust on that article. Yes, there are lots of people providing solutions and calling it zero trust, but there are many elements to zero trust, and it can't be solved with one software solution. So I would encourage you to look up the NCSE zero trust model. I will try and find it now and post a link in the chat.
Great, thank you. So back to Andy. With regards to sandboxing, is that just related to malware? Some software does not have a supported version, so will never be compliant. Can we segregate these from the internet and other networks, i.e. sandbox them?
Yeah, so yeah, no, that's not, that wouldn't be compliant. The only way you can de-scope an application, I suppose, would be to de-scope the device that it's sitting on, and that would be to put it into its own VLAN or have a boundary file set up in between the scope subset and the de-scope subset. So this is one of the reasons that we took sandboxing out of the requirements this year. It was a common misinterpretation. A lot of people believed that the use of sandboxing could be used to de-scope. It was always meant as an anti-malware control, and it kind of paired up with application allow listing. So application allow listing was saying that you could only run specific signature-based codes based on what that certificate said it was, and you accepted that these executables could run. And sandboxing was where they didn't have that signature. You could run it inside a sandbox instead of using application allow listing. So it kind of paired up with application allow listing. This caused a lot of confusion. Like I said, it was taken as a misinterpretation to push these unsupported applications through an assessment on a scope device. So to remove that confusion, we've had to remove it from the requirements. We've just included that within the application allow listing. The way it's written now should hopefully allow it to be as it was originally intended.
Great, thank you very much, Andy. I'll ask you this one as well. So as a school, it is not possible for us to implement multi-factor authentication for all users on all cloud services, i.e. Office 365. This would create a serious barrier to learning for our students. All staff have multi-factor authentication implemented. Can you suggest a way that we can still be compliant with the new requirements of Cyber Essentials? When you say this, you can't say that you can't set the scope for every student at home on their individual router. It's just not possible. How can you implement this? As how can young kids know how to authenticate on their device? It's not possible.
Okay, so there are a number of ways that you can apply multi-factor authentication. I put a link to a blog earlier in the chat. I'll do an announcement of it again now. This announcement is a link to an NCSE guidance about MFA and how you can apply it. So if you look at that, the guidance, there's 5 ways listed in there, but for Cyber Essentials, we'll only accept the top 4. So that's using a managed enterprise device as an extra factor, using an app on a trusted device as an extra factor, using a physically separate extra factor, or using a known or trusted account as an extra factor. So those are the ways that you can apply MFA. It's not just using something like a mobile phone or using or linking into a router belonging to the home device of a student. Obviously, unfortunately, where this isn't possible, and we know that it will cause barriers for some people, you can still pass the assessment, but as Neil said earlier, you'll be taking one non-compliance for not being able to apply it to all standard users. So that is just there. It shows that you're not meeting the controls. It shows that you're recognising, and it's kind of, we're letting you know and we're informing you that that there are areas of weakness within your infrastructure. Unfortunately, it's not compliant for the scheme because everyone must authenticate using MFA, and it would be down to the business decision of the school as to what controls you put in, what services you're providing for your students, and this is a common, I guess, a common issue as we develop technology. Obviously, security needs to keep up with the availability. So understand that's probably not the most helpful answer, but take a look at that article, see what can be done, and see what you can do to sort of beat this, and ultimately make sure that your students and your services are as protected as they can be and remain compliant with the scheme.
Thank you very much, Andy. Neil, how do you deal with the use cases where the assets are supplied and managed by a third party, like laptops, and they do the asset management as well?
Those third-party devices are because you don't own them. The controls will need to be applied by the third party because they're the guys that have access to carry out the administration. This is a scenario we now realise is more common than we first thought, and actually those third-party devices would need to be included on a CE certificate by the organisation that own those devices, and you know they have the administration to access to carry out and apply the controls.
Great, thank you. Andy, if we have an internal network protected from the internet via a hardware firewall and servers on that internal network are only able to access internal resources and Windows updates on the internet, is the server in scope or out of scope for Cyber Essentials?
So that would automatically be in scope from the outset, if you think, because it's accessing the internet. You're able to access the internet to receive those updates, and that's what we want. We want to see those servers get those updates. That's a good thing. So those servers would be in scope. Now, because you've got a boundary firewall in between those servers and other areas of your network, it would be up to you whether you choose to scope them or you descope them. So you can descope them by putting an excluding statement in, and that excluding statement would provide clarity on the certificate that there is part of your network out of scope. So you can have whole organisation excluding, and then you name the network that you're excluding.
Great, thank you. Neil, where ISO 27001 is held and SOA includes relevant controls, could some Cyber Essentials controls not be taken as met, i.e. asset management, asset controls, etc.?
Okay, so we get this often and we see this quite a lot in assessments. We've got ISO. They actually are two separate, completely separate types of certification. So ISO manages and understands the organization's risk appetite, whereas Cyber Essentials is demonstrating by prescriptive control that you are actually applying these updates. So you do actually need to be controls. You need to be applying those controls in a prescriptive manner. So you need to be saying you're actually doing that thing. We don't normally compare ISO with Cyber Essentials because of this. They are two different ways. If you went on from, so obviously there is a little bit of crossover in the fact that you may be doing asset management. That will help you understand what devices, software solutions, etc. are in scope, but we can't directly compare to ISO 27001.
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to add to that Cyber Essentials was originally developed because the government had, in fact, large organisations in its supply chain with ISO 27000 that were getting breached. And when they looked into the breaches, they realised it was because of the very basic controls that those organisations were being breached. So that is actually why Cyber Essentials first came about, to stop that. Okay, one for you, Andy. Are cloud-hosted telephony systems in scope and their associated handsets and firmware?
Cool. So yeah, so IP telephony is not one of the devices that we would call out as a device, but it is included as an organisational service within the requirements. So the service itself is in scope. We wouldn't expect to include just some of the handsets. It depends what kind of handset it is. If it's one of these kind of Teams phones, then that would be considered as a smartphone or a tablet. That's accessed with an organisational service, so that would be included in scope. It all comes down to looking in the requirements document, looking at those definitions and seeing if it applies to you and your infrastructure, depending on the equipment you've got.
Thank you. Another one for you, Andy. If we operate an in-house software package ERP that's hosted in IaaS Azure, Windows IIS role, does this fall under your definition of cloud service?
Just read that again. Yeah, I think it does. So IaaS is. Have you published that? Sorry, Emma.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yes, it's going to go from there.
Can I answer that? I can help.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, the Azure, because it's accessed across the internet, is classed as and its infrastructure as a service, that is classed as a cloud service. So the underlying, definitely the operating system of that instance, etc. Yes, it's a cloud service, and we'll need to apply MFA to it where required for the access to it for the administrators, etc.
Great, thank you. So Andy, for third parties that manage network devices like routers and firewalls and won't give out technical details, won't the third party's CE+ certification be sufficient?
Tough, this one. Where they're not going to give you the information, how can you confirm that your network is secure and the controls are applied to them? You can, of course, so if you're in a managed office or something like that, you can purchase your own boundary equipment and you can put that make that as your boundary. Or the other alternative is to use your software firewalls to create your own boundaries within that managed office.
Great, thank you very much. Neil, in a zero trust environment, how would a CB approach the internal workstation assessment? Historically, they've come on site and run a scanning tool. What if my zero trust implementation renders this impossible? Can I use my own tool and provide the results or output for analysis?
Okay. When we're talking about doing a CE+ audit, we have a list of approved scanning vendors, and they need to be, or the internal audit must be at least observed and controlled by the assessor. We don't allow the applicant organisation to run those and just provide a series of reports. The reports or the scan has to be set up under the guidance of the assessor if using the organisation's scanning tool. Very clear that the assessor must be in control of the internal scans, but they can use it. Yeah, they can use your internal tool if it meets the requirements and is one of the tools that is listed that the assessors can accept.
Great, thank you. A very quick question here for you, Andy. Are servers now part of the CE+ device vulnerability scan?
Yes, they are. So they are included as part of the internal scan, so the sample to the internal scan. Obviously, don't expect CE+ auditors to carry out an assessment against them for the desktop side of things, so like the malware checks and account separation and all the MFA things that you do against a standard user, unless it's a VDI desktop. It's providing a VDI desktop, then that desktop is checked to make sure that it's set up and configured in a compliant manner. For the internal scan,
sorry, that has always been the case in Cyber Essentials.
Yes.
When there was 5 different organisations delivering it, there were some differences in the way that it was delivered, but certainly the intent has been that has always been part of Cyber Essentials. Neil, what's the difference between a cloud service and a website that we use regularly? And someone else has asked, what is the difference between a cloud service and a web application? Because there's confusion with them all.
Yeah, a cloud service is, and a description, and this is now in the Montpellier question set and is agreed with the NCSE. For the purposes of Cyber Essentials, it is a service where you subscribe to, and that's whether it's paid or free, and you have some control over setting up users or administration of that service. So we're very often talking about Salesforce, MS365, Google Workspace, but that's just the tip of the iceberg of what is a cloud service. Web portals, where you don't have that level of access and can't turn MFA on or set up the users or assign roles to them, they're not the same. So if it's a hotel booking system, that would be classed as a web portal. We get so many different ones here. It's difficult to judge, but it is based on that level of administration and whether you subscribe to that service.
Great, thank you. Andy, some developers need local admin access to compile, debug and check in source code changes using their standard account. Would this be an auto fail? And if yes, how do organisations manage their local admin privileges needed for the dev team members?
So there's lots of different ways you can manage it. There's lots of different, you could use group policies is one way that you can achieve this, but it wouldn't be an automatic failure of Cyber Essentials. You would have problems should you wish to go ahead and undertake CE Plus assessment. So one of the core controls is that you need to have account separation between standard users and administrators. And if that can't be achieved, if you don't want to achieve that and you need to go for CE Plus, we would suggest that you descope your developer network. That is a method that you can do to move it out of scope. Obviously, we'd like you to or it's best practice to get as much as you can of as many of the controls applied to that descoped portion of the network as you can. But if you really can't achieve it, then the best option would be to create a developer network and descope it. Assessment.
Thank you. Neil, one of your favourites. For application whitelisting and MDM, the written policy, is it enough or do we need to have technical controls in place?
Obviously, if you have a solution that allows it, you should be applying it technically. We know this is difficult for organisations, but yes, there is the option to do it by written policy. But if you have the technical ability or the technical solution to do it, you should do it using that solution. It is available within products in Intune and back end of Microsoft 365, Google Workspace, etc. Just to be clear, the absolute intention of Cyber Essentials is all the controls should be applied in a technical manner. That has always been the intention from the outset, and not to rely on written policy or documentation to apply the controls. And we are still very much enforcing that, and that is how the NCSE would like us to do that. So this is why when we talk about MDM solutions, the control of smartphones and tablets, yes, we would like to see some technical control, and if you have it, it's the best solution for you to apply.
Thank you. Andy, if online login is disabled on an Office 365 account and users only use the Outlook on their Office computers within the network whilst in the office, is multi-factor authentication still expected for those particular users?
So if it's only available on the trusted network, if you set it up that way so it can only be reached through the Office network, then that would be multi-factor authentication. It would depend how that's implemented, but yeah, it's a cloud service at the end of the day, so multi-factor authentication would need to be applied to those accounts.
Great, thank you. Neil, where can I find a list of the approved scanning tools for the internal assessment?
The rule of thumb for this, guys, is the approved tools are what's on the PCI DSS. It's called approved scanning vendors list or database. That's where we reference. But when you do this, many of them, so the CBs can offer you this, and we are looking to publish this anyway, and it will go into a knowledge base. We currently don't have it in a format to send out, but that is the rule of thumb, is that any scanner, we approve all the scanners, they've got to be on the PCI DSS ASV. The most common ones we see are scanning tools from Tenable, Qualys, and places like that. There are often products that are marketed as vulnerability scanning tools, but they're not listed on the PCI DSS ASV. And there's many of the anti-malware or malware protection software solutions say they're vulnerability scanning, but it is not at the same depth and level that is required for to be compliant for scanning in Cyber Essentials.
I've just added the link to that as well in the chat, so people can look at that, and that will show you the vendors that would be accepted. And one other thing to sort of bear in mind for that is that the assessor carrying it out would need to know how to use it, so that'll be a chat between yourselves and the CVs directly for that. They need to remediate any issues that happened from that scanner.
Great, thank you. Andy, some medical devices rely on operating systems and software that's no longer supported, but these devices are essential. Can you suggest a way to make such medical devices compliant, or can they never attain CE?
Yeah, so those devices themselves would never be compliant for CE. What we would see most people doing with these is they don't need to be connected to the internet. So you'd put them into a subset, and then you'd cut all inbound and outbound internet connection at the boundary of that subset. So that's what we would see most organizations do that have these sort of unsupported operating systems tied to medical equipment. Now they can still communicate across that boundary to in-scope devices. That's still possible, but as long as internet connections cut at the boundary to that subset, if you like. And if you look at the requirements document, you'll see the definition for a subset in there. As long as that internet, all inbound and outbound internet connection is not get to that subset, then that would be absolutely compliant. You wouldn't have to de-scope them in a scoping statement, and you could scope as whole organizations too.
Brilliant, thank you. Neil, if you have DNS service provided by a third party that allows the registration and management of public DNS records via the third party website, is this classed as a cloud service and in scope, or a web app and out of scope?
Good question. Good question. I'm trying to, we would have to look into it, and it would probably be down to who's providing the DNS service, but it's not normally, I would say, I think that's something that warrants further discussion. We often get things that sometimes catch us out a little bit, and that's one that's caught me out, I'll be honest, but we'd be happy to discuss that offline. Probably, yeah, we could answer that if we had a better discussion. I can't give you an instant answer on that, I'm afraid.
So the person who asked that question, I mean, you can ring or email info at and just say that you want to be put through to Neil or any of the technical team. Neil's actually often out and about talking, so any of the technical team would be great. Right. There is quite a lot of multi-factor authentication questions. Let me see. So would multi-factor authentication be required for in-house developed apps that are hosted on-site systems and not cloud environments? Andy, do you want to take that one?
So if they're internally hosted, it wouldn't be a requirement. I'll probably get in trouble if I say it's a recommendation, but it's an option for your as a method to prevent brute force. But if they're internally hosted at this present moment in time, it's not a requirement in itself that it must be MFA. You can use one of the alternative methods of brute force protection, but you know, MFA is one of them. So especially if you're developing it and it's going to go and become a fully fledged cloud service in the future, that's not hosted internally, then it would probably be a good idea to include that.
Thanks. Neil, for connection to Microsoft 365, can MFA be implemented once a week, or does it have to be implemented at every log-on connection?
No, there are different, there's obviously different time limits you can do it. Just to let you know, we actually use 365, you know, we talk about this, so we know how it's configured. Yes, you can set time periods for how long they are logged in with that. No, it doesn't have to be every time, but it needs to be configured on the user account. That's what we're looking at. You can't be selective with which users have MFA. It must be applied to the whole tenant, but we don't set any conditions about the time limits or how often.
Thank you. Andy, we use Microsoft 365 application protection to sandbox corporate data across access on mobile devices, separating it from the device, operating system and other apps. This protects us from BYOD. Does this satisfy the allowed applications list?
Yes, I believe it does. So this is just like a sort of similar to a MAM type scenario, I'm guessing. So that would be, so if you only allow, if you're dictating what can run within that sandbox and you're managing those applications, then that is your application allow list for BYOD. Now, don't confuse it with unsupported applications. So everything would still have to be supported on that BYOD, but you could obviously do that through some kind of written policy telling users to ensure that all of the applications on their devices are supported still. But in this instance, for the application allow list, that would be a good way to achieve it, and having it written within that piece of software is a good way to demonstrate application allow listing for your BYOD devices.
Can I just chip in there and just say it's important to note that using those kind of containers and sandboxes does not exclude a device from scope. Those BYOD devices still remain in scope.
Great, thanks. Neil, does manufacturing machinery running proprietary software that doesn't get any updates often, that needs to be connected to both the internet and company resources to operate correctly, does it need to be declared out of scope, or can it be moved to a separate VLAN with specific ports open to lock it down? Or would these devices need to be declared as out of scope?
Right, okay. Right, it would be highly advisable if they're getting no updates, no support, etc., that they are on a network segment. So be clear, a subset is effectively a network segment that is defined by a VLAN or firewall. These particular manufacturing devices, if they require access to the internet, you as an organization will not be able to obtain whole company certification, but you will still be able to obtain certification on the networks that meet the controls and the requirements of CE. So you'd need to include an excluding statement, which is question A2.2 of the question set, explaining which networks are not included in the assessment. I hope that helps.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm aware we're very over time. I'm just going to do one last question, but please do contact us with any questions that we haven't answered. And this recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel in a few days' time. So final question, Andy, do we need to enforce multi-factor authentication to our customers, as our product is a SaaS cloud service? We have single sign-on in place, but we don't enforce it.
For the customers, I think I've already answered this one a few times today. So this one's
sorry.
yes, that's fine. So single sign-on's a bit of extra bit added to it, so I can talk about that as well. So it's quite a good opportunity to chat about this. So yeah, for the customers, again, if it's your assessment that the concern is with, then your customers do not come into it for multi-factor authentication. But because you are offering that cloud service, if they're getting CE, they will need to have MFA applied to their application for Cyber Essentials. So this means that you would probably get quite a lot of customers coming back to you saying, yeah, please do give us MFA, access to MFA, if it is a cloud service to those based on the definition that Neil gave out earlier. For the SSO, so when we talk about authenticating via MFA, so that just means the authentication method of that cloud service needs to use multi-factor authentication. So if you want to do some kind of SSO or federated access, or there's all these different names for the different ways that you can do it. And so, for example, we've got a number of cloud services that we authenticate via Azure. So as long as that Azure instance has got MFA applied, you are still authenticating using MFA for all these extra additional cloud services. So again, that would be compliant too. The main thing is to think about whose organizational service it is, whose organizational data it is, and if that's organizational service is part of a cloud service, then that must be authenticated to using MFA for the applicant.
Brilliant. Thank you very much to Neil and Andy, and thank you all of you for staying with us for this long session. As I've mentioned before, we're going to upload the recording to our YouTube channel, and that should be there in a few days. We have a free LinkedIn group which you can join. So that is called the Cyber Essentials Advice Group. If you go to LinkedIn and search a Cyber Essentials Advice Group, you can join that group. You can post questions and our technical team will answer them. Please be careful not to post anything that could be sensitive, because we don't have any control over who reads the questions. For everything else, please email us or ring us up and we will try and help. And don't forget that there is the readiness tool, which will take you through a lot of these questions and links to guidance that we get a non-technical person to write. It is checked by our technical team, but we try and make it as untechnical language as possible. Please also send us feedback. What do we do that helps? What do we do that doesn't help? And how can we make the scheme better? So we want positive and negative feedback. That's what we need. So thank you again for attending. And yes, and we'll see you again another time. Bye.